State of Football, back at it again, Part 89 edition here on this December 3rd, 2020. Amazing, folks, amazing. Part 89 here in December, counting you down to the 2021 NFL Draft. It's what we do here at the NFL Draft Bible. But this is your new home for real football talk in the mornings. I am one of your hosts, Ric Serritella, here broadcasting live from the Jersey Shore, of course, with my co-host daily, John Murphy, down in New Orleans, the VP of Personnel for the Toronto Argonauts. Wave to the people, John. You can smile. It's okay. Of course, out in Kansas City, we've got Dane Vandernat, the Executive Director of the NFLPA Collegiate Bowl, who joins us here each and every Thursday. Dane, how are we this morning?
Doing great, Rick, man. Love the hibachi intro here, man. We're gonna dice it up and start throwing some shrimp up in hats.
Chopping it up here on another jam-packed football edition. We've got some great guests. Jeff Benedict, New York Times best-selling author, will join us at 9:20 to discuss the Patriots Dynasty. We'll have Neil Stratton at 9:40 to discuss the industry insider news. We'll kind of talk about some of these front office rumblings, what he's hearing. Of course, he's always got his ear to the ground. And hey, fresh off matinee football, the Steelers taking care of business. We had a little RG3 in our life, a little Trace McSorley. It's all good here on the State of Football, but we're going to turn our attention to some of the risers, some of the surprises, some of the guys who stood out to the NFLPA Collegiate Bowl scouting staff. We'll look ahead at the upcoming weekend, and who better to do that than Dane Vandernat. So let's kick it off, Dane. Who are some guys here that grabbed your attention this past weekend?
Yeah, and Rick, John, I try and keep it fresh every week and not just be talking about the same guys, same teams over and over. But I mean, to me, it's tough to not mention what Notre Dame's doing with Ian Book and Javon McKinley, the receiver. I mean, Book, an efficient 23-33, against the Tar Heels, 279 yards and a touchdown. I think he's really elevated his game a little bit, minimized some of the turnovers that kind of plagued him and the inconsistent decision-making. Still need to see him see the field better, and that's going to come with time. But to me, he's still projecting as a nice backup for the next level. And then McKinley, I mean, once again, led the team, catching 6 for 135. I continue to say it, but he's one of the better blocking wide receivers in college football. Obviously productive from a receiving standpoint, but very productive from a blocking standpoint. I really think that NFL teams are going to appreciate his pro readiness. I think he's a graduate transfer, this year. So, I really like the headiness that he plays with. Also had some nice performances, by some defensive players for Notre Dame. They're certainly littered with a lot of future draft picks there. And I always have to give a shout out to one of my favorite players coming out this year, Michael Carter, the talented running back from North Carolina. But I thought going over across the country here, big game, Stanford Cal. I know, Rick, linebacker you like out there, Golden Bear, Cooney Dang. And I might be pronouncing or butchering his first name there, but
Coin.
What is it?
Coin.
There you go. Led the game with impressive 14 tackle performance, 1 for a loss, rangy, athletic, long, looks like a good developmental will linebacker next level. And I think, his athleticism really going to aid his production on special teams early in his NFL career. And then in their shutout against the Minutemen, how about Liberty's Ralph Rusens, the Latvian native, showed up in a big way, recording 5 tackles and a forced fumble. For a big man, he's really got good lateral movement skills and range. Another good developmental prospect for the next level, I think NFL teams are going to appreciate. And then finally, I get to give a shout out to one of my favorite prospects this year in wide receiver Dez Fitzpatrick from the Ville. I think Dez has all the tools to be successful at the next level. If he flies under the radar due to Louisville's run-first offense, not getting a ton of opportunity in the passing game, but in their loss to Boston College, he had his most productive game of the season, caught 8 for 182 and a touchdown. And, again, it's another guy that I think is going to be, one of the top senior receivers in the NFL draft this year. And then finally, honorable mentions to good old Zach Thomas from App State and Charlie Brewer from Baylor and your boy CJ Marable from Coastal Carolina there, Rick.
Yeah, Marable came back. I think he had, 3 touchdowns this past week. And hey, Coastal Carolina, here comes ESPN Game Day this weekend. Liberty at Coastal Carolina. And you mentioned the defensive tackle there, Ralph Rusins. I think hope I'm getting that pronunciation right. But John, it's an interesting nugget there. Some teams may be looking to flip him over to the other side of the ball.
Yeah, I mean, you look at that kid's story, and we mentioned it a little bit earlier. In the year when Liberty got off to that fast start, he was a basketball player, and he finishes his high school career playing basketball. And his dad says, hey, what about this football? There's this football thing in town. Why don't you go check it out? Like maybe it's something for you to do while you move on in life. Just keep playing sports. He goes out there and he's doing it. And one of the guys that's coaching the team is a guy from the Army base. And it's a U.S. coach who happens to be over there. And he goes, hey, I think I can get your kid a scholarship. I mean, that's an amazing story that this kid is now borderline, with an NFL grade and literally played basketball all the way through high school age. And didn't start doing anything with football until they see like an adult men's league team playing across the world in another country. And just so happens that somebody that's over there working is a former U.S. coach working over there in the armed forces.
Was it Nick Nolte?
Probably. Yeah. Sees the kid, probably doesn't have to offer his dad a tractor in order to sign. And all of a sudden here, here's the kid going to a camp and Liberty was the first team that came up and spoke to him. But if you want to know what kind of personality the kid has, when they came up and said, hey, why do you think Liberty offered you a scholarship? Because I was the biggest guy there. He doesn't try to take any credit for it. He's like, I was the only guy there that looked like a football player. That's why they give you a shot. So, great story, great personality. And I think what you see is, that's an interesting body type, and he has a basketball background. He also did some like boxing, MMA, that type of stuff, in his background growing up. So he has a lot more kind of flexibility, to his body. And it might be interesting to see, a kid like that at the next level, especially now. Think about it this year. We've seen it with Steven Sullivan out in Seattle. They've kind of trained him as a tight end and as a defensive end. A guy like that could be your third string on both sides of the ball next year might be a really interesting guy, to have on your radar. And it has worked before. There's been a couple of guys that teams have flipped over, from D tackle to offensive guard. And, you'd be surprised if you can do it. There's some good money in it for you. So he's definitely an interesting story.
And to that point too, John, if I can jump in here, Rick, forgive me. We all know that nose guards are taking on a less and less role in the NFL every year as the league becomes more pass happy and every defense is looking for undersized, quicker players that can affect the quarterback in the passing game. For a big man that's 330 pounds, you're right, John, because of his lateral quickness, because of his foot, speed, because of his athleticism, his balance, the whole 9 yards. He is a very intriguing piece of clay for NFL coaches to potentially work with. Coming from Latvia, coming from a non-traditional football background, it's easy to project there's going to be a learning curve for him. With that said, I still think, hey, look, this could be a guy, because he can move, he may end up having more value in the passing game, even on the defensive line, than some may give him credit for, going forward. Again, you sit there and really get him with a veteran, savvy D-line coach, really work with him and, teach him schemes. I mean, get him lined up. If you run a lot of, some sticks, or you run a lot of, twists and stunts with him, he may be productive coming around on, an ET stunt looping over. I mean, this guy has ability to still show up on both D-line and O-line. So to me, he, very intriguing player. I agree with you, John. As well as anyone, NFL is always looking for athletes, number one, and then get them trained up. And by the way, if there's one position that you can probably play without having deep football background and ties, it's probably D-line. Go get the football. Of all of them, that's going to be the easiest one to pin your ears back and go.
Running back and D-line. See the hole, hit the hole. That's an incredible story, though. Jerron Jones, I was trying to think of it. He was a recent kind of convert guy, D-line to O-line. The Giants tried to experiment out of Notre Dame, by the way, who you mentioned there, Dane, who suddenly now you think of them for linebackers, defense, O-line, D-line. Now suddenly they're sprouting all these playmakers. And you mentioned the receiver there, McKinley. They got Skowronek. The running backs, the underclassmen are bursting out now. But Coin Dang, let's touch on him because, speaking of the basketball background, his parents immigrated from South Sudan. He was a basketball guy too. In fact, he started off at Virginia Military Institute as a basketball, football kind of dual athlete. I think there was a year at Independence Community College in between, and then he lands at Cal. But I'm trying to kind of pinpoint where he fits at the next level, John.
Yeah, I mean, what you do like is that there's a lot of potential scheme versatility to what you see out of him. And I think he's another one where it's not a finished product yet, right? So to me, that's going to be interesting to see his off season here, in terms of the factor that he's not a finished product, that this is not at times the most pure instinctual player, but he can do some things because of his natural athletic ability that others can't. Position coach is going to look at that and say, what can I do with him, once I get him kind of up to full speed in an NFL system? Or is it going to be something that they see him being a guy that's going to take a little while, to adjust at the next level? But to me, the factor that he has started to show that you could do some things with him, as an open field guy, that it doesn't all have to just be coming forward, makes him to me, that body type and just that range that he potentially has, gives him the, ability to fit in kind of in a number of different roles at the next level.
We'll definitely be keeping tabs on that as we get closer to April. Of course, Dane Vandernat here, NFLPA Bowl Executive Director, along with John Murphy, Ric Serritella, chopping it up here on a Hibachi Thursday. Dane, another weekend filled of college football. We won't have too many of these now. We're getting down to the nitty gritty here. So who are you going to be keeping tabs on? So many guys opting out also. So yeah. We're really getting the slim pickings.
Yeah, you're not lying there. I mean, I thought Kirk Herbstreit, had an interesting last couple days here. And it is just going to be interesting to follow with these opt-outs. I mean, it's disappointing for, I think, a lot of them. But at the same time, you can certainly understand where some of the guys are coming from with their teams unable to practice and play. And, might as well start preparing for your next phase of your career. But at any rate, getting on to games this week, looking forward to seeing tomorrow night. Got the high-flying Louisiana down there for John, right? Put up 70, John, last weekend on Louisiana Monroe. Going against the App State Mountaineers. We talked about Zach Thomas. We know that the Mountaineers down in App State, they got some offensive talent. So looking forward to seeing that one tomorrow night. And then on Saturday, West Virginia, Iowa State. Can the Mountaineers continue to play the spoiler this season against the Cyclones? And which kind of Cyclones team is going to show up? They've been dominant in some games and a little more competitive with the other team in some other ones. And then finally, I'm interested to see the Ohio Bobcats against the raging 4-0 Bulls of Buffalo. Can Frank Solich's defense slow down Jarrett Patterson and this Buffalo offense? It's going to be an interesting one, and I know that if there's one team in the MAC it's going to be prepared, it's going to be Ohio. So it should be an interesting game.
Yeah, Frank Solich, man, just hanging on, doing his thing there. You forget he's still kind of hanging around over there in the MAC. So some really good games. And Buffalo, man, that was an exciting one to watch just to see if Patterson was going to get that record. And, he had the opportunity, man. It went down to the very end. So good stuff there. Any thoughts on the players that he mentioned there, John?
Yeah, I think you mentioned every week we want the MAC games. Somebody comes out of a MAC game every week that you're going back to the drawing board, kind of to take a look at. And I think last week not only was it Jared Patterson, but it's going back and watching that O-line play. and those guys are just killing it, up front, for them. And then, like I mentioned, we must have the president and CEO of the Malcolm Kuntz fan club, because somebody had him in top 50 or top 75 or top 100, whatever it was. So Malcolm Kuntz and his family must be paying for their draft Bible early, because they certainly did get a good mention last week out there, Dane. And here's something for you, and sometimes you got to root for what you can root for when you're not having a good year. Alabama is favored by 30 over LSU. But if you're at LSU this weekend and you go to the game, there will be something good you can watch. And you know what that is? Mason Smith and Corey Foreman on campus together saying that they're going as a package. If that happens, they won't be favored by 30 next year, because that's the number one D tackle and the number one DN in the country, both kind of saying they're going to the same place. And if you're looking for a little foreshadowing of why that might actually be happening, a local 3-star D tackle decommitted from LSU yesterday might just be finding out that your place on the depth chart would be a little harder to manipulate if these two guys are going. And if you listen and you're LSU, what you really liked is the number one D tackle in the class saying, hey, you know what? When I'm watching these games and they're not performing, you know what I see? I see opportunity. I see opportunity come in there and be the reason they get back on top. That could be a problem.
Wow.
I think the thing is, there was a couple of teams, Clemson and Arizona State and USC, that were very much taken by surprise that Corey Foreman and his family opted to come back for this game, because they were originally scheduled to be there when this game was supposed to go off originally, put it off, and it made all the teams out west and Clemson think they had a shot of getting them. And now him and his family are taking a third trip down memory lane over there to death. It's not often. Ed Orgeron's got a pretty good hit rate. Doesn't have a good hit rate on the field right now, but he's got a good hit rate of closing guys when they show up on campus a third time. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And that is the largest line that a former national championship the next year has faced, 30.
LSU setting a couple of those unfortunate records, I think, this year, right? John, I still remember the day when all they talked about was the spread offense isn't going to work in the SEC because they play defense. Now all of a sudden you got 30-point spreads, not just point totals, spreads. But no, I mean, you know what? I'll tell you what, going to Baton Rouge, as everyone knows, getting down there, having Orgeron and co put the sell on and sit there and say, hey, look, we need you. We need to get back to a championship level. We need you guys coming and helping us turn this tide. That can be a big draw for some of these young men that are going on these visits these days.
Yeah, no doubt. And they don't mind selling them the Patino special of three and out. And 3 and out means you come here, we start doing 3 and outs and win a national championship, 3 and out, and you're going to the NFL.
Yep.
LSU knows how to recruit them. Dane, Vandernat, Executive Director, NFLPA Collegiate Bowl, bringing you the names you need to know here each and every Thursday. Always appreciate the time here, Dane.
Appreciate it, fellas. Have a great week.
All right, Ric Serritella, John Murphy here, the State of Football, your new home for real football talk in the mornings. And next up, we have a very special guest. He is New York Times bestseller, Jeff Benedict, and he has a new book out. You'll see it right behind me, actually, The Dynasty. And Jeff, thank you for sending us a couple copies. This thing is a beast. And not only that, it really is maybe the best book I've ever read. I mean, it's so well done, so in-depth, so detailed. And so now we're going to spend about 15 minutes or so kind of diving into it, but it's available now. Make sure you go get it on Amazon, The Dynasty by Jeff Benedict. And there he is. He joins us right now here on the State of Football. Welcome into the show. Good morning, Jeff. How are you today?
Hey, good morning, guys. It's great to be on with you. Appreciate you giving me a few minutes and a chance to talk about the Dynasty.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. And I've had a chance to dig into this book now, and the amount of detail and background and information that we didn't know. You know, people ask me, hey, what's so different about this book, right? There's been so many books done about the Patriots, but there truly are so many stories that have not yet been told. And, I don't know how you pulled it off, but you had access to the Krafts, you had access to Belichick, you had access to Brady, and it shows. Actually, I wanted to ask you, I was actually reading up on how the book began. Is it true that you wrote a letter to Robert Kraft and he wrote you back? Is that how this thing got started?
That is true, actually. I didn't have any connection to anyone in the organization, certainly not the big three. And when I refer to the big three, I'm talking about Kraft, Belichick, and Brady, of course. I'd never covered the team. I'd actually never been to Gillette Stadium in the capacity of a journalist. I'd been there as a fan attending games, but I'd never gone there as a reporter or a writer. And never even actually been to a press conference that the Patriots had put on. So I was clearly an outsider, and I felt like I needed to build a relationship with the organization. And to me, the obvious place to start was with the owner, because the book that I wanted to write about how the dynasty was built and then how it was sustained for so much longer than previous dynasties in the NFL. And so I did write Robert a letter, and I introduced myself. I assumed he would not know anything about me. So I really wrote a letter that was similar to, I don't know if you guys did this, but I think a lot of your listeners probably can relate to coming out of college and trying to get your first job. And you don't have a lot. So you write a letter and you try to explain to somebody who you are and why they should give you a shot. And that's essentially what I did in my letter. And I also gave him some names of some people that I had that had allowed me inside previously, like Coach Krzyzewski at Duke, who let me inside the Duke program for a year to write a cover story for Sports Illustrated. Steve Young, who allowed me into his life for a few years to write his biography, things like that. And then I just laid it out in written form what I wanted to do. To my surprise, he wrote me back. I didn't expect to get a letter back from the owner the old-fashioned way, like literally go to your mailbox and open it, and amongst the bills and the advertisements was a letter that came from Gillette Stadium, and it was from him. And that was the beginning of a dialogue that obviously got deeper and richer over time, but that was my initial entry point that led to a meeting and eventually the ability to start getting inside the organization. And I spent my first year, just so you guys sort of get a sense of how this happened, I spent my first year, which was the 2018 season, the season that would end with them going to the Super Bowl and beating the Rams in Atlanta. That's when I started working on the book, that fall in training camp. And I was around the team a tremendous amount that year. I was at all the games. I was in the locker room. I was in the building. I didn't approach Belichick or Brady for interview requests until a year later. So a lot of what I did that first year was what I call really in-depth research. A lot of it is observation. And I'll give you just a quick snippet of what I mean. And this story, if you've read all the way to the end, you know this is a story that's in one of the very last chapters. But in the 2018 season, the Patriots early in that year hosted Miami. The game was a blowout. And, by the 5-minute mark of the fourth quarter, there was no question who was going to win this game. I was watching that game from the owner's box. When I was at games while working on this book, I wasn't typically watching the game. I was watching people who I was writing about. In this instance, I was watching the owner. I was watching the owner watch his team. And in that game, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was Robert Kraft's guest. So he was in the owner's box that day, among other dignitaries. When there was a few minutes left in the game, Kraft invited Pompeo down to the Patriots locker room so he could be there when the team came off the field and entered the locker room after the game. I shadowed them down there. I followed them to the locker room. So I rode in the elevator with them down to the bowels of the stadium and then into the locker room. He was showing Pompeo Tom Brady's locker, which is right next to the double doors that swing into where the training room is, where players go to get worked on. Rob Gronkowski was in there because he had left the game with an injury. He did not know that the owner was in the locker room with the Secretary of State. He comes bounding through the doors and boom, almost hits the Secretary of State with the doors. And Robert says hello and introduces him. And you notice that Gronkowski has an injury to his lower leg. And he's got a gigantic ice pack taped around the bottom of his, like from his calf down to his Achilles. And you can see blood seeping through the ice. And Kraft asked him if, what happened, if he's okay. Gronkowski's talking about it. And Kraft says, we got to have you next week because we're playing the Colts. And those are the guys that started Deflategate. We got to have you next week. And I'm like a fly on the wall. I'm just sitting there as if I'm not there watching this. And then moments later, the team comes in and Belichick goes directly to Gronkowski. And when he does that, I'm close enough to Gronkowski, I can touch him. And Belichick taps him and says, "You okay?" "Yeah, coach, I'm fine. I'm fine." "No, are you okay?" And he's, "Yeah, coach, I'm good. I'm fine." And for that moment when I'm sitting there, like, to me, that is more important than getting to do an interview with Rob Gronkowski, because what I'm seeing is unvarnished. It's not rehearsed. It's not staged because there's a journalist there. I'm pretty invisible, but I'm seeing this thing in real time, how these guys interact with each other. And then as they kneel for the Lord's Prayer after the game, and everyone's kind of huddled around Belichick, the players are on one knee. This was Josh Gordon's first game as a Patriot after being out of the league for a couple of years due to suspensions from substance abuse. Here's a scene for you, and this is in the book. As they kneel down, Kraft reaches for Gordon's hand and takes it as they kneel. And then the Secretary of State, seeing this, grabs Gordon's other hand. So you've got Gordon kneeling down between Kraft and Pompeo, and then Tom Brady is standing behind him with a hand on the shoulder. And I thought to myself, where else in the NFL could Josh Gordon go and on his first game back from a long suspension be literally surrounded by Belichick, Kraft, the Secretary of State, and Brady? I mean, these were the kinds of things that I saw from inside, and it allowed me to write the book in a way that was much more intimate.
Yeah, the some of the stories are just incredible, and you kind of get a newfound respect for Tom Brady's toughness too, going out there shirtless with the flu, the playoff game with the thumb injury, just so many good details in the Dynasty by Jeff Benedict, who joins us right now, available on Amazon. It's a thick book, but it's a quick read because it's hard to put down. Of course, joining us here with Ric Serritella, John Murphy. Go ahead, John.
Hey, Jeff, how are you, sir?
Hey, nice to talk to you.
You too. So I think one of the most interesting things about how you went about doing this is twofold. One, do you think you earned a lot of these stories by doing it the way you did, like kind of sitting back at first, not like what you said, like, hey, a lot of people would see Tom Brady, Robert Kraft, and Bill Belichick be right in front of them and instantly want to kind of start the book right there, and go right to them. And then to be kind of pulled back and do all the layers first. Do you think you may have earned some more opportunity with them to that you made them feel comfortable enough with you to then open up in a different way than they would have if you had kind of aggressively gone that way first?
I appreciate that question. That's actually a really interesting and great question. I wish that we had an audience of journalism students to listen to what we're talking about right now, because the way you earn people's trust is by demonstrating that they're safe with you. So here's the analogy I would use. If somebody lets you into their bedroom, which is the most intimate place you can go, and the purpose of going in is because what you've asked for is, you say, I'm really curious to know what's on your nightstand. Because nightstands tell you something about people, particularly if you have books there. What a guy reads at night, it says something about a person. So under that pretext, the gentleman lets you in the room. And that's the only reason he lets you in. And you enter the room, And what you spot in the far corner, the opposite end of the room, away from the nightstand, is a thong pair of underwear, balled up in the corner. Well, that's interesting. It's titillating. It raises questions, but that's not why you're there. That's not why you asked to come in. That's not the story you're writing. And so I think the thing for me, I knew the story I wanted to write, and it's about building a dynasty. This is a book that is ready-made for football fans. And you said it's a quick read. It's long, but it's quick. I wrote this for guys like us who watch football, who really want to understand how this happens, how it works, to get inside. I wasn't trying to write about sex, lies, and videotape. That's not what I'm doing. And so here's an example. When I interviewed Tom Brady the first time, I waited a year before I even asked for the interview. I was around him, but I never talked and I never opened my mouth until I was ready to do that interview. First, I spent 25 hours composing the questions for the first interview. 25. It's a lot of time. And when Tom and I sat down the first time, we were in his suite at the stadium. It's just him and I had 2 tape recorders on the table. But before I turned them on, I looked at Tom and I said, look, he knew the questions because I'd sent a bunch to him in advance in writing. I did the same thing with Bill. But I said to Tom at the top, I said, look, I'm going to work my way down. If I ask you a question that you don't want to answer, just tell me you don't want to deal with that question. I'm not going to infer anything negative from that. And I'm not going to ask you why you don't want to talk about it. I'm just going to go to the next one. And he was like, great, thanks. And it's just one way of signaling to people that this is not 60 minutes where you're standing there with a camera running, waiting to trap or catch someone. I'm trying to get people to open up and talk about things that are intimate and that they've never talked about before, but that relate directly to the book that I'm writing. And so does it matter that Tom Brady was in a car accident and that morning he, left his house with a smoothie before somebody crashed into him? Well, that story is in the book because he was literally inches away from maybe ending his career in 2010. That was a pretty important moment from a football standpoint. And so it's really identifying what are the stories that are off the field that need to be in the narrative.
That's outstanding. And I, Jeff, we might have to have you back. I can round up some journalism students. I'm enjoying listening to you talk. I'm curious to know, and we're talking to Jeff Benedict here on the State of Football, Ric Serritella, John Murphy. If you're just tuning in, we will edit this segment and put it out there on YouTube and Twitter so you can go back and listen to the whole interview and the segments of the interview. But I'm curious, have you spoken to any of the big three, Kraft, Belichick, Brady, since the book's been published? If so, have they read it? What was the feedback like? What was their reaction?
So without getting into specifics, I'll just say that all the feedback that I've had from the organization and from the individuals you mentioned and or people that are associated with them has been very positive. Nobody knows until the book is out, like what you're really going to say, what's really going to be in there. And I appreciate as a writer that there's a sense of angst about what a writer might put in after all that time and what you've seen and what's come out of the interviews, because you don't know what other people have said, what other people have told you. And so one of the things that I've come to appreciate over years of doing this is to try to put myself in the shoes of the other guy. If I'm being interviewed and someone's going to write about me, and I've had that, I've been interviewed and I've had people write about me, usually magazine writers or newspaper writers. And I've seen how those stories come out. And sometimes you read them and you go, man, I wish that guy hadn't done that. I wish that's not what I meant when I said that, or he took it out of context. I try to be really thoughtful about things like that. Obviously, you got to be truthful in what you write. I'm not suggesting anything other than that. but there's a way to do it where you put the proper context around it so that people have understanding. And so you can't soft pedal the fact that there was tension in the relationship between Belichick and Brady. That's a fact. So you can't like ignore it, and you can't sugarcoat it and make it appear as if it's something it's not. You got to deal with it. But when you deal with it, you have to set the stage properly with context and facts that enable the reader to see, yeah, okay, I get it. And that's one of the reasons I compare Brady and Belichick to Lennon and McCartney, is because I think people can understand that Lennon and McCartney produced the greatest music the rock and roll business will ever see or listen to. And 50 years later, we still look at them as the gold standard. We always will. But we also know there was some tremendous friction and tension in that relationship. They were two musical geniuses. And after less than 10 years, they couldn't work together anymore, and they split apart. And as solos, they never could get back to what the Beatles were. And that's why I made the analogy with Brady and Belichick in the book, is that I think Kraft recognized fairly early on he had Lennon and McCartney on his payroll. And it was all about how to keep them together. And that's why you have 20 years of Belichick and Brady. It probably should have been 10. And that's the thing I really show in the book. I don't say that. But what you're seeing is by 2010, this whole thing could have spun apart. Brady's contract is up. Belichick has a history of getting rid of guys by this point in time. Tom's coming off a major knee surgery, reconstructive. It just seemed like this was sort of the Joe Montana, Bill Walsh, Eddie DeBartolo moment where Tom leaves. And then that doesn't happen. And that's where Kraft comes in as such a major force in this story. And it leads to 5 more Super Bowl appearances, 3 of which they win.
Yeah, and you learn what a crafty and savvy businessman Robert Kraft is throughout this book. A great book this is, The Dynasty by Jeff Benedict, New York Times best-selling author, joining us here on The State of Football. Ric Serritella, John Murphy. John, final question for John here?
Yeah, the thing I respect the most about this is 2 things. One was your willingness, when you've had the success, that they've had, that's great. But you were equally as successful in what you do as they have been in what they've done. But the willingness to do these interviews in all the different patterns and ways that you did them. I thought the funny one was Randy Moss, how you got Randy Moss's kind of interview. And it wasn't to your, kind of comfort level all the time. It was, I'm going to get the best out of them by giving them the most comfort or the best scenario that makes them feel comfortable doing it. And to also say that, hey, you start by sending a letter, and then you also have a time where you're to yourself saying, hey, I'd rather have Bill Belichick give me longer answers in written form than maybe somebody else would want that interaction or want to sit in with him as much as possible. So I think that the book almost was more important than for you as the author to get out of it what you wanted. What the people are getting the best out of this book is because of your willingness to kind of do it in a way that I'm not sure a lot of people would have had the same comfort level to kind of put that material together in the same way.
Yeah, I think suppression of ego is really important in journalism. And journalists lie if they say they don't have egos. They have huge egos. And just like athletes do and coaches do, it comes with the territory. But I think in order to do these kinds of books, you have to remind yourself as a writer, it's not about you. The reader doesn't care about what you did or what you saw. They just want to have a wonderful experience reading the book. They want you to take them back in time, put them in the room, let them feel like they're the one in the room watching all this stuff happen. And so that's how I go about it. I mean, that opening scene of the book where you're in the emergency room and the doctor is cutting an incision in Drew Bledsoe's chest, And then, a few hours later, you have Belichick, Brady, and Kraft standing over the hospital bed when Bledsoe wakes up. That would not be possible to write that scene that way if the doctor doesn't cooperate with me. And you guys know, doctors aren't allowed to talk about their patients. It's illegal. Unless there's one caveat, unless the patient gives them permission, consent. And the only way that's going to happen is if Drew Bledsoe trusts me enough when I ask him, will you give the surgeon permission in writing to talk to me about what he did with you in the ER? That's a big ask. And he'd never been asked that before, but he agreed to it. And that allowed the surgeon to then open up to me. And then it allowed me to tell the story in a way that only a surgeon can tell. I'm not a doctor. You're not a doctor. Most football fans aren't doctors. So in order to recreate that scene and have it make sense to a layperson, the guy who is watching games on Sunday, is you need the surgeon to break it down for you in a way that is the way we talk about football. I need the doctor to talk to me that way about medicine so that a football fan can read that scene and go, wow, that's what was happening in the room. And so that's that process for me as a writer that I went through with this book. And I'll just say it was an absolute pleasure because I was so fascinated by the Patriots' success. For me, it was all about just understanding. It's like, will you let me in the engine room so I can just see how this all works and kind of tinker around with different things and move the levers and turn knobs and see how this machine cooks. And fortunately, for a couple of years, they let me do that.
Fascinating stuff. Just an incredible book. Get it now. The Dynasty, Jeff Benedict. You see it there. It's available on Amazon. Of course, New York Times bestseller. You've written multiple books there, Jeff. And congratulations to you and your continued success. We thank you so much and appreciate the time here today.
Hey, guys. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas. And it's been a pleasure.
Same to you. There you have it. Jeff Benedict, New York Times bestselling author, The Dynasty. John, your copy, I'm sending you one. I have one here for you that Jeff sent, a second copy for me. I know I said I was going to put it in the mail last week. I'll put it in the mail this week. I got you. We keep it moving and keep it grooving here from one author to another. We've got Neil Stratton here, Scout Speak. That book also on the counter. You can get this one too on Amazon. Of course, Neil's got two books, Moving the Chains, if you're into the NFL draft process, and then Scout Speak if you're into the scouting world. You want tales from the scouting trails, behind the scenes, what it's like to be a scout. This one is really worth your investment. So the holidays are coming up. Looking for some gifts, make sure you go to Amazon, support these guys. They do incredible work. And of course, Neil Stratton joins us every Thursday here on The State of Football, of course, InsideTheLeague.com, Succeed in Football blog. And Neil, we'll get right into it because I know you've been waiting patiently, and we'll throw you into the fire here. A lot of moving and shaking here now. This latter part of the NFL season, you're seeing front office shakeups. You're hearing rumblings. Some candidates now, kind of being leaked out to the media who might be in the mix. Let's start off. Obviously, we heard about the Lions. Head coach and GM are both gone. Texans and Falcons were already, open there. Jacksonville now has an opening. What else are you hearing?
Well, hearing a lot. And I think you're seeing a lot in the media right now, a lot of jockeying, a lot of names that are kind of coming up. We're seeing search firms being engaged. To my knowledge, I think only the Texans so far have definitively hired a search firm. I'm not sure what direction the other three franchises will go. But there are a number of names. Obviously, I've kind of touched on those in the blog in the previous weeks. I've touched on those. We did a big piece, actually a 2-week series kind of this spring on some of the names, some of the bigger names, some of the names that are kind of off the radar. I'll be discussing those in the Succeed in Football blog this week. Also wanted to note, I really am humbled to follow a real author like Mr. Benedict. I assume that you're having me on, means the check must have cleared. So I'm really glad that the mail is still functioning during these COVID times.
as far as what exactly, the jobs themselves and the teams and the positions that the new GMs will be in when they get there, that's something we'll touch on tomorrow in the Friday wrap. And we have 4 franchises who have varying, they have a different quarterback situation. They obviously have a different coaching situation. Not all of them have let go of their coaches already and haven't kind of cleaned house. They have different structures of how their scouting organizations work. Their quarterbacks are on different contracts and that kind of thing. And so that's kind of what we'll look at tomorrow. These different franchises. I mean, I think, we did a bit of a survey about, I guess 4 or 5 weeks ago when the Falcons first let go of the GM and the head coach and asked several former GMs, what team do you feel like would be the most advantageous? Most of them came down on the side of the Falcons primarily because they admire the blank ownership. They like the way the team is run. They feel like it's a really distinguished franchise. Now that there are 4 openings, it'll be interesting to kind of look at those different 4 jobs and their varying characteristics and, kind of which ones might be the most favorable for winning immediately. We'll look at the last 3 records for each team, obviously, and a number of different factors that I think go into whoever comes in an interview and how they look at the team and whether it's going to be a cleaning house kind of situation or whether maybe just a few tweaks can get them back on track.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, too, I think, when you get to the interview process and the COVID world and how much will be done via Zoom, how much will be done in person. Obviously, you're investing a lot in these people. And you mentioned the search firms, and I believe I heard Detroit is also engaging with the search firm. Is this just a legal way to tamper with the search firms, Neil?
Well, I guess there's some measure to that. I mean, if I'm the Lions, I'm very careful about what search firm I hire. Last time they hired a search firm that didn't really have an extensive sports background, and then I guess what was a year later, we found that Matt Patricia had some pretty embarrassing, to say the least, things in his background that maybe the search firm should have found out. Maybe the Lions should have known before they hired him. I think hiring a search firm gives you a certain level of comfort maybe, or a way to kind of distance yourself from the process. And it certainly has become a popular way to do things, but I'm not certain that's the best way to do things because typically your search firms are going to come out with the most homogenized candidates, the safest ones, the ones that are, I guess the media really tends to love. That's not always the best one to have. And winning the press conference, as I tweeted this week, is very different from winning football games. Sometimes the guy that you get who doesn't have the pedigree, who doesn't have to check all the boxes, is not always the perfect guy. And then factor in, and I know y'all know this as well, in the old days, you hired the GM hired the head coach. Now the head coaches are making so much money. That has kind of been flipped. And now typically we're seeing, we saw this in San Francisco, we've seen it in other teams. The head coach comes in and he kind of selects his GM. So, I think to some degree the Jags may be at a bit of a disadvantage because right now they haven't formally let Doug Marrone go. Perhaps that happens, after the last game. But I think if you're a team that already has a clean slate there, you've got a much better chance of bringing in one of the more attractive head coaches, and then he can in turn bring in someone that I think will be attractive as a GM candidate as well.
Interesting stuff. Yeah, I feel like the search firms really grew in popularity like over the past decade or so. I'd be curious to see what their hit rate was looking like. Like, how successful do these search firms do? They get it right more than they get it wrong? It would be, I think, interesting. I know you've got an intern somewhere, Neil, that they can crank that out over at Inside the League.
Well, Rick, it's a great question, and something we started tracking just last year. We tracked the search firms. I think there were 27 head coaching changes in FBS at the FBS level last year. About 2/3 of them, maybe a little bit more, use search firms. I'm interested to look in 5 years. Hey, how did these search firms do? I don't know that anyone's tracking that in a substantive way, at least on our side, to kind of call balls and strikes on these guys and say who's doing the better job, who's not. Do you even need a search firm? I noticed that Southern Mississippi just named a head coach, or at least they're expected to, I believe, name Tulane's offensive coordinator as their head coach. They didn't use a search firm. Again, I know that's not the NFL, but search firms have become so ubiquitous in the process, and they're so popular and all these kind of things that it is interesting to kind of take a bit more of a balanced eye at them and really look and see which ones are performing, which ones aren't. Is it safe, but not necessarily the best way to go?
Yeah, I know they're not cheap. Neil Stratton inside the league joining us here on the State of Football, your new home for real football talk in the mornings, along with Ric Serritella and John Murphy. John, what do you got for Neil here today?
Well, I guess we could ask Jack Easterbay because according to him, he created search firms.
I didn't know he took credit for that, but Jack's an interesting guy. I
Well,
mean,
he took credit for that, kind of like Gore took credit for the internet. Not the best move ever. Not your smartest move ever. But I think, like, doesn't it seem like it kind of in a funny way, it's like the person who's building their house, and then you come over and you're like, oh, like where you? Oh, I have an architect. Yeah, you're building a house. Okay, we're not building a. We know what there's walls, there's a roof, there's a door on the front and back. Like telling me you have an architect. I hired an architect for my house is the same as this shit. You know what you want. We know what we're looking for. How are these dudes telling you what you want?
Yeah.
And if you're going by that, you're probably not ending up, in any better situation, than you were before. And then I think what you mentioned is really interesting, that it seems like, like in Jacksonville, it was, well, like, hey, Doug, we stuck with you this long. We're just going to let you ride it out. Like, hey, we're not going to put somebody else at the tail end of this, and make it more confusing. We're just going to let you ride this out, to the end of the line. And I think the statement that he went out of his way as an owner to say that he addressed it with the coach is the nicest way of saying, I let him know that he will be riding this cruise all the way to the finish, meaning right to the finish and then off the boat. And if you're in Houston and you're hearing everything about Romeo Crennel, right? You hear now, like, this is one of two ways. If you hire somebody who says, I'm going to go in there and it's J.J. Watt and I may re-sign Fuller, but I'm going to trade Cooks for another draft pick, and I want to get Merciless out of there with that terrible contract. Mm-hmm. Hey, then Romeo Crennel is not going to be the head coach. Mm-hmm. If you have somebody that comes in and says, hey, wait a minute, down the stretch, we were 4-3 and we had another game winnable there. And then in these last group of games, again, we went 3-2 and we split with the Colts, who were a playoff team. And here, look, the second half of the year, Deshaun Watson is a top 5 MVP candidate. Why don't we not do anything rash, re-sign Fuller, make a couple of changes, and hey, we got a shot to win 9 or 10 games next year? Well, then you're going to keep a lot of status quo. Mm-hmm. And who wants to be in there with all of that status quo that is emanating from another area, in the building? Mm-hmm. Right. And I think the Atlanta part, would be also just as interesting to say, are you now having to judge the candidates who would be looking at this and saying, I'm on board with we're not as bad as we look. And this is a second year in a row where the back end of the season, we're going to play better than we have, but there's nothing to gain or lose. There's a couple of winnable games in there, so are you, kind of narrowing your look, right? I mean, you've heard it down in Houston. I've heard it here. All of a sudden, Rick Smith is potentially in the mix for Houston or Atlanta. That wouldn't necessarily be the first name that would jump to most people's mind, but it would in those two scenarios, whereas a Jacksonville or a Detroit might have an open slate, and people might start looking at that Jacksonville, gig with a cleaner cap and the extra draft picks as being, quite interesting, because the Khan family has all the resources in the world, to give that to you. You just have a bit of a fan base issue because of him taking those home games and giving them to the NFL to play overseas all the time. And that, hey, how do you align what you're doing down there to make the best decisions moving forward? But how do you see the Houston and Atlanta stuff with how they play the rest of the year? How much do you think that's going to go into things?
It's a very important point you're making, John. We sit here like, we're at the 25,000 foot level and say, oh, well, this is how things are going to play out. We still got about a month and a half left in the season. In that time, a lot of things are going to change. I mean, look what the Falcons have done with Raheem Morris. I mean, you can make the argument that if they just fix their defense, maybe they're ready to roll. Maybe, they bring in the right guy in the front office who can kind of engineer things, and maybe they come back. Then you look at the Texans. Hey, these guys, we're talking about 2 seasons in a row before this one where they won 10, 11 games and then 10 games. Well, maybe they just need a Band-Aid. They've got a great quarterback, but I think the perception is they have an aging roster. You pointed out a lot of the issues they have. Obviously, they traded a true impact wide receiver and haven't really been able to plug that hole. What happens the rest of the season has a lot to do with it. Obviously, they had an incredibly tough first 4 weeks of the season. And to some degree, Belichick was judged on that. And not Belichick, O'Brien was judged on that. And, now he's the ex-GM and head coach. We've got a lot to go. Rick Smith can be floated. There'll be other names that are floated. I've seen other names, obviously Scott Fitter and Trent Kirshner out of Seattle, and those are worthy names. But the point is there's going to be a lot that comes up in the media. Having worked with these search firms to some degree, I know that the agencies really work strongly with them. And then the search firms, it's kind of one hand washes the other. So on one hand, you hire a search firm because you kind of want to block some of the transparency. You want to have a way to kind of keep things in-house. But at the same time, the firms, the agencies who are strong with the media are also working with the search firms, and they can let any secret out that they want. They can create a campaign for anyone they want to. I would be really careful about putting too much stock into the names being floated right now because there's so much more that's going to come and so many things are going to change between now and then. Injuries could affect things. What's happening in college football? I don't think Justin Fields was mentioned on a par with Trevor Lawrence going into the season, but he's had such a magnificent season that you kind of have a 1 and a 1A situation rather than a strong 1 and a strong 2. So they're going to be any team that's got one of those top 2 picks, as Jacksonville does, is going to be attractive. And so there are a lot of things to watch as we go down the stretch of the season and kind of take stock of things before we really start making big judgments on what a team should do, who they should hire, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, I just got your email from this morning, Neil. I'm looking here. The Jaguars now have 7 picks in the top 127.
That's not bad.
That's appealing. That is appealing because honestly, 7 picks in the top 127. I mean, half of those, if you hit on half of those, you've got 3 or 4 new starters coming in out of the gates. And I think that is appealing. Now, on the flip side, you've got all that cap room. You've got to overpay free agents that want to come to Jacksonville. It's not the most desirable destination. So, I think there's a catch-22 there. But last question for you on my end. Does any of these interim guys stand a realistic shot to retain the job at either the head coach or GM level? Trent Baalke, Raheem Morris, Romeo Crennel. If you had to put an odds-on favorite for one of these guys to be retained, does anybody stand a shot in your opinion?
I think Morris is the clear leader there. I mean, again, and I kind of touched on this earlier, but he's really. They've had a lot of success. They've played well. They should have beat the Lions if they had. I mean, I think he's something like 5-2 or something since he's come on. And maybe you argue that if Quinn would have stayed, that they would have kind of rebounded. There certainly were a lot of people that were ready to get rid of Quinn last year, and then they kind of rebounded in the second half of the season. If this is a big week for the Falcons, if they beat the Saints this week, Raheem Morris has a pretty strong argument to stick around. And I don't know. I think there are probably a lot of Atlanta fans are going to hate to hear this, but they kind of want to change things. But status quo isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, look at Jacksonville, the team they built that went to the AFC division, or was it the AFC Championship 2 years ago with Jalen Ramsey and so many top players that they wound up having to break up for a number of different reasons. But they built a solid team, notwithstanding the fact they had Blake Bortles at quarterback and those kind of things. They had some real studs on defense. They've done. Quietly, they've done a pretty good job in the draft. And now that, Caldwell's out and you've got that haul of picks there, that could be a very enticing job for someone. I'm pretty sure Marone's gone, but whoever does come in could have a nice situation there.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Neil Stratton joins us here each and every Thursday on the State of Football. Parting shot for the people. Want to give them a sneak peek? I know you touch base on the Friday wrap tomorrow, Succeed in Football blog. Where do you want to go with it, Neil?
We're looking at, the Friday wrap and the Succeed in Football block will both talk about the GM situation. We also talked to Miller McCallum. We've been we have a feature called Catching Up, and we talked to an ex-scout. Miller's an interesting guy, has some interesting things to say about his career, about what he's doing now and all those kind of things. So something's been kind of fun for people to read, and we're enjoying doing it as well.
And make sure you check it out, InsideTheLeague.com, SucceedInFootball.com. Of course, Amazon, Scout Speak. If you go all access on the NFLDraftBible.com, we got a few copies. We'll hook you up and mail one out to you. Of course, we had Jeff Benedict right before Neil Stratton here today with his book, The Dynasty. Dane Vandernat at the top of the show. We'll chop it up and break it all down and make sure that you guys have access to all of our interviews and segments. So make sure you log on to the NFLDraftBible.com. Of course, follow Neil at Inside the League. If you didn't know, now you know. John, it's been another hour of power. We'll be back with a Football Friday edition tomorrow. Big Law Lawrence Johnson will join us for that one. Parting shot for the people to wrap it up.
Neil, I keep thinking when Rick keeps saying the Dynasty, he's talking about my weekly picks. That's what I think. If you want to add something to your Friday scenario, is maybe you can get people to get online and give Rick a couple of helping hints here so that he doesn't fall behind by more than one score this weekend, because we're going double digits, baby. We're going double digits on him. He's going to have to start making some interesting picks. How much you want to bet Rick takes the Falcons? He's going to start the alarm this week. You gave him an idea. He's looking for ideas. He's got it on sticky notes. He's got it all over the place. He's starting to make some interesting selections.
I got the shovel, baby.
John,
Yeah,
John,
he had that early Russell Wilson kind of
pretty soon I need the backhoe.
Yeah, he kind of had that Russell Wilson feel to his picks the first 5 weeks. Everything was going right. Nothing could go wrong. Now Rick can't read a defense, and he's starting to turn the ball over. We're going to see what happens here. Maybe there's a little Rutgers magic left in those Rick picks over there.
Hey, John, when you're behind the fourth quarter, you got to play for touchdowns, all right? There's going to be some upsets. He has to, right?
That's cool, but that's why I told him I'm playing nothing but zone D. I'm taking the Bucks, the Raiders, and the Cardinals every week, and I can't lose because he's picking them every week.
We're in week 13. A lot of football left to be played. Remember that Kyler Murray Hail Mary a couple weeks back? Don't underestimate the kid, all right? Don't underestimate the kid. But I'll tell you what, man. What a great show to be a part of, man. I really appreciate everybody who tunes into this each and every day, of course, out there on the Twitter, Facebook, Periscope. I mean, what an education I'm getting here each and every day with our guests. And that's why we are your new home for real football talk in the mornings. We are here weekdays, 9 a.m. Eastern, of course, Saturday with the NFL Draft Tailgate Show. Your new home for real football talk in the mornings. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody.